Welcome back on a Kansas Sports Chatter. Time now for Stripes and Whistles with Kansas referees. And to guide us into this segment, we bring in Scott Goodheart, the Kansas State High School Activity Association Director of Officials. How are we doing today, sir?
Hey, I'm good, man. Thank you for having me. Excited to be on. Love to talk about officiating stuff and just kind of anything in general. But appreciate you having me on. Love Central Kansas. So,
We love you here too. Now, for this segment, for especially introducing this segment, going forward, we're going to talk about different techniques in officiating, maybe different rules, and just things that officials are looking for in a variety of sports. For this one, kind of maybe a broader stroke here, Scott. Officiating numbers. How do things look in the state of Kansas right now? I know that's been a point of emphasis for KSHSAA and for a number of folks for a number of years.
yeah, so nationwide, we've heard about there's a shortage of officials. There's a shortage of officials. And ultimately, I think, yes, there has been, or maybe by a location or by a sport, or just due to the time of the start. And NFHS came out just this past week with a note saying that, hey, there's a shortage of officials. However, there's really not, because we are past the pre-pandemic numbers. So, ultimately, just a few numbers to share with you. Our numbers have increasingly been growing ever since the pandemic, whether it's, people need the money, more stuff we're doing with educating schools and people pushing that curriculum. But ultimately, we're up 279 officials just in our state.
Wow.
Last year was 5,288. Now, granted, you talk about a shortage, and it's, when you talk about shortage of officials, again, like, it's a difference in Western Kansas where it's more rural versus Kansas City. They may have plenty of officials, but they can't get to a 3:30 ball game, or their job doesn't allow. So again, and I think, it's hard too, because, even football, we probably have plenty of football officials, but everybody wants to play on a Friday night. And sometimes that's just not feasible too. So, but like I said, ultimately, I think pre-pandemic, obviously they said that numbers were low, but we're getting back to a good state. So now, obviously, the biggest thing is to continue to trend that way and keep that way moving. Sometimes they talk about officials number, they talk about recessions or different things like that, that people are looking for additional money. And obviously, officiating is a good supplemental income potentially. So there's probably some truth to that as well, I would say.
Where do you still see the biggest demand for officials? Is there a specific sport that stands out in Kansas?
Ultimately, football is kind of probably one of the harder ones, I would say, even though numbers are pretty good at that. But if you think about it, if you're on a crew, you are dedicated for at least 9 weeks of varsity football, sometimes even more. Basketball, I think, is tough just because there's a lot of judgment that goes into basketball. If you talk to our colleagues in the southwest part of the state, soccer is huge. Like, there's a huge need for that. But then in Kansas City, there's a lot more soccer going on. So we have a lot more officials there for that. And they can obviously bounce over from the Missouri side if they need to. So again, it's just very unique. I would say one of the ones that's probably alarming is softball, just to the fact that our average age of officials is probably oldest in the softball group compared to others. So, but even like wrestling, those numbers are good. We get a lot of help from the KWA and the KWCA, where they support, they'll pay for kids, or even, I say kids, but basically high school students, to register. That way they can work those youth tournaments and get some experience. So, I mean, I don't want to sit here and be a negative Nancy or anything to that nature to say that, we have shortages. We do, but ultimately we're in a pretty good state. So I think it's just that key piece of, trying to educate kids or educate people to be, I'm not saying, we all have competitive bones in our body, right? When people are keeping score, there's a different thing about it, but still, we're
Sure.
human. We need to treat officials as humans. That's where it comes into effect. And a lot of times, like, I will say this to this day, that they're not yelling at you, the person, they're yelling at the shirt. That's they see the stripes, so therefore they think it's a cheap admission price to come in and let's heckle the officials. So, I mean, I think that's just the nature of it, unfortunately. But however, I do think there are some many times that stuff crosses the line that shouldn't be taken either. So.
For someone that wants to try it out for officiating, what's the learning curve like for a rookie? What resources are available for them to just get better?
So we try to do a lot of training stuff in the summertime, because that seems to be kind of a good opportunity for low key opportunities, just to, kind of ease into it a little bit. There's a lot of clinics that go on that are really good. We've tried to get some more of those in the southwest part of the state with baseball, for example. We got one started at Dodge City. And, you think about it, and yeah, you can sit there and talk about positioning and outs and balls and things like that. but how many of them actually have to call a ball or strike? And that's the very first thing they're going to see. So we even added in some bullpen sessions, which you think is, well, that's kind of silly to add that. But if you think about it, that's a lot of times that has to be discussed, because that first time a ball comes in that's on the white and you got to make a decision if that was a ball or a strike, you kind of freeze up.
Right.
I was talking with a colleague from football. It's the same thing. As we sit here and we'll look at plays and positioning where we need to be at. But what's the very first play of the game? It's a kickoff. Do any of the officials maybe know where to stand in the first year? Probably not, because we didn't do kickoffs at the jamboree or a clinic or anything, the 7-on-7s, whatever other things that were offered. So, I think, like I said, ultimately summertime is a great, like, low pressure, low key, low opportunity to go in and do that stuff. However, right at the start of the season, that's where you get a lot of your repetitions. Volleyball clinics, we've had those going for a long time from our office. Football clinics, the LOAs, which there's not really any LOAs in the western central part of the state, which is unfortunate, but there's opportunities that way. There's so much stuff out there now for, if I look at kids and stuff with technology, you can go on YouTube and see stuff. NFHS Learn has some officiating courses that are really good. So, I mean, YouTube, sky's the limit. I mean, social media, it is all over, man. That's the crazy part of this, to where a lot of people can see that. So,
Hey, Scott, appreciate the time. Look forward to our chats going forward.
all right. One thing I did want to add too, as far as when we're talking about, educational things, I want to give a big shout out to Ref Reps. They're kind of our officiating curriculum group that we partner with. If I could, any part of the state, if you threw a dart, there's a lot of schools doing it. I know Central Plains is one that's looking at starting it there in Great Bend, which is awesome, or the Great Bend, excuse me, Barton County area. La Crosse was another one that's been going for a while. And I want to say even Kensley's, Maxville's, a lot of the schools are doing it, which is really awesome to help educate and get individuals in that. But again, if you want to learn more about becoming an official, go to KSHSAA.org, click on the officials tab, go to the central hub, and happy to assist. And like I said, my information's everywhere. Happy to help however I can. So,
Scott, good stuff. Stay busy, man.
all right, appreciate it. Thanks for the time.
That is Scott Goodheart, KSHSAA Director of Officials here on Stripes and Whistles with Kansas Referees.